downstairs on the lower level. An accessible toilet is located on this level under the stairs, and in the event of an emergency, the event staff will guide you to the nearest exit and provide further instructions. There will be a drinks reception following the Q&A session, apologies there, until 7 p.m., and all attendees are very warmly welcome to attend. So it really is a great honor for me to introduce this evening the 14th Fulbright Distinguished Lecture with journalist and commentator Fareed Zakaria, and to thank our partners for their work with us on this annual event over so many years. The Institute of Politics at King's College London, the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, the Lois Roth Foundation, and in particular, our hosts here this evening, Oxford University's Department of Politics and International Relations, and of course, Pembroke College, which I'd like to highlight is celebrating its 400th anniversary this year. It was, in fact, at Pembroke College, exactly 100 years ago, in 1924, that J. William Fulbright, a recent graduate of the University of Arkansas, came to do his Rhodes Scholarship. This immersion in completely different cultures to his own, including a 1,200-mile road trip to Vienna, Krakow, and Vilnius, would be one of the seminal experiences of his life, and indeed a powerful inspiration for the international scholarships that bear his name. As he himself put it, "My experience as a Rhodes Scholar was the dominant influence in the creation of the Fulbright Awards. Coming as I did from an interior section of our country, quite remote and isolated from foreign association, the Rhodes Scholarship probably made a more vivid impact on me than it did on some of my colleagues from metropolitan areas." J. William Fulbright went on to become an influential and visionary statesman, an outspoken critic of McCarthyism, the longest-serving chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the creator in 1946 of what is today the world's largest international education program, a program active in 150 countries that has from the outset aspired to further more than just academic knowledge. At the Fulbright program's heart is the promise of a better and more peaceful world through the empathy that immersion in another culture can cultivate and the international collaboration that education exchange can build. At the same time, it is important to recognize that there are negative and painful aspects to Senator Fulbright's biography. His voting record on civil rights contributed to the perpetuation of racism and inequality in the United States. His opposition to racial integration in public spaces, including education, are clearly at odds with the ideals of the Global Fulbright Program and with the US-UK Fulbright Commission's commitment to achieving excellence in education through welcoming and celebrating the diversity of background, experience, and perspective of our two countries. The contradictory legacy of Senator Fulbright is a painful paradox, but it's not one that we at the Commission shy away from. Engaging honestly and openly with difficult, complex issues, including our founder's history, is exactly what the Fulbright experience should be about. Our mission is to advance knowledge, promote civic engagement, and develop compassionate leaders. The Fulbright Distinguished Lectures and the opportunity they present to engage with a leading thinker on a matter of global importance are a key part of that mission. Over the past few years, our lecturers have addressed such thorny topics as how to bring the international community together to tackle climate change, how to plan for the next pandemic in this very hall, and what it means to build grace-filled communities that embrace both difference and inclusivity. Tonight, we're privileged to hear from Fareed Zakaria and to engage with his perspective on the increasing strains on the liberal international order that was established, as was the Fulbright program, in the ashes of World War II. But first, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Rana Mitter to the podium. Rana is the Distinguished Historian of China and Transatlantic Scholar who was until recently professor here at Oxford and director of the university's China Center. He is still an senior associate with the Department of Politics and International Relations here, but spends most of his time as St. Lee Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Mitter will do us the honor of introducing our 2024 Fulbright Lecturer.
Thank you very much indeed, Maria, and it's a huge pleasure to be here this evening. First, because it's wonderful to be back in my old academic home. I only left a little while ago, but nonetheless, it's always a pleasure to be back. And also because, of course, it gives me a chance I thought I'd never have again to wear a gown, and one should never turn down those opportunities. But the third and most important reason is that it gives me the chance to say a very few words, but I think important ones, about a figure who will speak to us tonight, who I have admired for many years and come to know over that period as someone who is an incisive and immensely thoughtful interpreter of international affairs. Indeed, so important did I consider it to be here this evening to introduce our speaker, that I actually returned within the last 24 hours from Beijing. Yesterday morning, Thursday, I spent in the company of a very, very interesting speaker from one of the major Beijing think tanks. And I thought that we would spend time discussing various aspects of US-China relations or Chinese communist policy, whatever it might be. Not a bit of it. Instead, what he and his colleagues wanted to talk about was the American election. And when I say talk, we were talking about, they were bringing forward issues like, well, if you look at the way in which voting patterns have changed in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, and you see the number of red votes that come in, and then how in the later part of the night the blue note ones come in, it was all coming together in great detail, and combined, in their case, with a sort of big sweep picture of international relations between the US and China. I finally said to the senior think tank scholar there, a dyed-in-the-wool Chinese think tanker, that if CNN ever lost the services of Fareed Zakaria, he would be well placed to apply for the job, which he nodded and basically muttered words to the effect that he'd certainly think about it. So watch out, there may be a rival for the throne. On the other hand, I think it will be hard for anyone to match the extraordinary career that our speaker tonight has had. Born in India, Fareed Zakaria went to college at Yale, and after that forged an extraordinary academic and public service or public intellectual career in the United States. He took a PhD in government, which is at Harvard what we call political science, from Harvard University in 1993. Amongst the various teachers who influenced him were Samuel P. Huntington and Stanley Hoffman. Many in this room, as experts in these fields, will know that that's an eclectic but very powerful set of influences to have had, along, of course, with the great theorist of international relations, Robert Cohen. Fareed then took a different path from many of his cohort who went on to academic careers. He became, at the tender age of 28, the managing editor of the journal Foreign Affairs, well known, of course, as perhaps the premier place to publish articles that will not only analyse international relations with great rigour, but also have a tremendous amount of influence in the conduct of public affairs. I know this myself, since many articles I've had in the journal have been translated in China, and then I get all sorts of social media complaints from people over there saying that I've completely misinterpreted what's going on. Fareed also took an academic position as an adjunct professor at Columbia University, and then moved up the chain of distinguished journalism with immense speed, but also with immense depth. He worked at various periods at Newsweek, and then moved to Time magazine to become editor-at-large and a regular columnist. People who keep an eye on US media today will know that he remains a regular columnist now for The Washington Post, currently, I think, being taken over by the Brits, as so many media organizations are, but none the worse for that. And has also found time somehow to write not one, but a series of important and very well-received books. Because I want to keep this short, I won't mention them all, but I will briefly mention a couple because each of them relates in some way to an aspect of the ideas that Fareed has placed in the public sphere. The Future of Freedom, published back 20 years ago, was subtitled Illiberal Democracy at Home and Abroad. And while everyone is talking today about illiberal democracy around the world, it took someone like Fareed, with a rather different way of looking at the world, to help pioneer the term both in the academic and wider sphere. He wrote The Post-American World, a subject which, of course, we'll return to. But again, this is, in a sense, a subject in progress, which Fareed has been developing and coming to. He's also written more recently 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. Again, that was published in 2020. And most recently, in fact, this year, not content with those achievements, has published Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present, an immensely erudite and wide-ranging argument about the meaning and significance of revolution. But let me finish these thoughts with perhaps the reason that he is best known around the world. And that is, of course, his television program on CNN, Fareed Zakaria GPS, which, in case you're wondering, stands for Global Public Square. It's been running since June 2008, and it reaches hundreds of millions of homes and also, of course, hotel rooms, where, of course, many of us catch up on everything we should have known about public affairs in our busy lives by, instead of doing the reading, turning on Fareed and finding out what we really need to know. The show has been widely recognized, not just in terms of its reach, but also in terms of its quality, winning a Peabody Award, one of the major broadcasting awards of the United States, and it's been nominated for the Emmy on several occasions. Fareed's achievements have also been recognized elsewhere, including in his country of birth. In 2010, he was given the Padma Bhushan Award by the Indian government for his contribution to the field of journalism. So an accomplished writer, speaker, thinker, broadcaster, and amongst other things, someone who forces us to think in a way that might not always be comfortable, but is always necessary in a world which is changing very fast and often in ways that are hard to read. At that moment that we sit in now, where things are moving faster and more uncomfortably, I can think of no better guide to the post-American international order than Fareed Zakaria. Would you welcome our distinguished Fulbright speaker today?
Thank you so much, Rana. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and it's a huge pleasure to see all of you. I don't know whether one has to follow the traditional kind of Guildhall banquet salutation, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen. But if so, consider it said. It's a huge pleasure to be able to do this at Oxford, which, for all Americans has this kind of hallowed place, this feeling. My only connection to British education myself is that my father came, but not to Oxford. He was a young, bright, poor kid in India, and in those days, if you came first at Bombay University, you got a fully paid scholarship to an English university of your choice. And he chose to go initially to the London School of Economics to work with Harold Laski, who was a very important, probably the most famous economist alive in his day, and then ended up going to SOAS and getting a PhD in history. And so if he had chosen otherwise, maybe I would have been a legacy at Oxford, not that that helps one much. It's also a huge pleasure to do this in honor of William Fulbright. Fulbright was probably the most important senator to have left a mark on foreign affairs, certainly in modern American history. And so it's a particular pleasure to do it in that context. And of course, Fulbright's most famous work was in 1966, as the United States was ramping up its military presence in Vietnam, as anti-war protests were sweeping the country. Fulbright wrote what became his seminal work called The Arrogance of Power. And it was an argument, a very powerful, persuasive argument about the overextension of the United States abroad, arguing for a foreign policy of much greater restraint. And it came on a whole decade and a half from Korea to Latin America to the Caribbean to Africa of American involvement in all kinds of coups and counter-coups. I would argue, though, that today the world faces almost exactly the opposite problem. The international system we faces the opposite problem. The issues facing the world are not the result of America's overextension, but rather its underextension. And what the world needs is not less American power and purpose, but more American power and purpose. And that tells you something about the transformation of the world and the kind of challenges we're grappling with. For the last 30 years, the United States has lived in an unusual, perhaps historically unique circumstance. It has had no great power competitors, and it has had no great power competition. This is a very unusual characterization of international life. In fact, you probably have to go back to the Roman Empire to think of a moment when you had really one power that dominated above all the others. If you think about 1995, China is 1.5% of global GDP. Russia is in free fall, having collapsed as the Soviet Union, and its economy contracted between 1990 and 1995 by about 50%, which is probably the largest contraction of any major economy, certainly in peacetime. Who were the other potential great powers? Germany, Japan, that owe their security to the United States. So it was a truly unusual, maybe unique period. And what was also true was that it was a period characterized by American preferences, ideologies, and policies that became global. Liberalization, marketization, open technology platforms, democratization. All these trends were sweeping the world. Think about a place like Latin America. In 1985, almost all of Latin America is run by juntas. By 1995, almost all of Latin America, really with the exception of Cuba, is run by democratic governments in some form or the other. And so it felt as though we were in a truly different world, in a world in which the international system that had been conceived by Franklin Roosevelt, implemented by his successors, the open international system, the liberal international system, the rules-based international system, call it what you will, had become the international system, was encompassing the entire planet. And as we watch American power wane, the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves is the liberal international order also on the wane? The world of international life has been characterized mostly by power and by realpolitik. In Thucydides' famous words in the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. But we have had a different set of ideas about international affairs for many centuries now. The world of a rules-based international system is new in comparison to the world of realpolitik. And like so many liberal ideas, it emerged from the European Enlightenment. Alfred North Whitehead once said that all of Western philosophy are footnotes to Plato. I sometimes think all of the liberal Enlightenment tradition are footnotes to Kant. And sure enough, if you look, Hugo Grotius begins this process of beginning to think about a new way of thinking about international life. And he talks about international law based on natural rights and reason. But more than a century and a half later, it was the paradigmatic Enlightenment philosopher Kant who, in the midst of the bloodshed of the French Revolution, published an essay titled Toward Perpetual Peace. Kant described what was needed to achieve the conditions of permanent peace, not just the temporary absence of war. And his ideas sound strikingly contemporary. He argued for a world of economically interdependent republics where citizens preferred trading to fighting and had the power to determine policy. He sought a federation of free nations governed by law rather than by might, a precursor to the idea of international organizations like the UN. Kant envisioned a future that was rooted in the rights of human beings as opposed to the self-interest of states. Now, for many centuries, those ideas stayed just that, ideas, but they began to get lodged in one power in particular, one great power, the United Kingdom. I've always thought that part of this came out of a high Protestant sense of mission that influenced British statesmen like Gladstone. But for whatever reason, you began to see British power see itself as providing more than just naked self-interest, public goods that we would say today, like the freedom of the seas. In practice, it meant the Royal Navy suppressed piracy, which protected peaceful vessels conducting trade, no matter what flag they flew. Britain did also use its sea power to protect freedom more literally. Once it abolished the slave trade, it aggressively enforced that ban on its own subjects and on other countries. By 1860, the Royal Navy's West African Squadron had seized 1,600 slave ships, freeing 150,000 people in the process. And Britain was really the first great power to actively raise moral issues with other countries and to place weight on them, and to place some weight on the idea of a rules-based system and the idea of international law. Now, I do not have to be reminded as an Indian that Britain pursued these policies quite inconsistently and, in fact, pursued policies that were the polar opposite with savage brutality in its colonies. But that doesn't change the break that marked this kind of British behavior. In fact, one could argue that one of Britain's main motivations for entering World War I was that it felt honor-bound to uphold a commitment that it had made to its ally Belgium, which was facing German aggression and autocracy. A realist would have made an accommodation with Germany, as the historian Neil Ferguson argued that Britain should have done. Gladstone spent a lot of time talking about ideas of foreign policy that would in some way fuse freedom with self-interest. And he was himself overtly influenced by Kantian ideas. But it took a devotee or a fan of Gladstone, Woodrow Wilson, to actually begin to try to enact these liberal ideas. After World War I, he tries to build a lasting peace by setting up the first major global organization, the League of Nations. But Wilson, who was a somewhat cold idealist who had no feel for practical politics, was famously once said to be of the... he was characterized as being the kind of person who loved the people but hated people. And as a result, badly bungled both the diplomacy abroad and at home. He ended up presiding over a vengeful peace that left Germany embittered and outside the international order. Back home, the Senate refused to have the US join the League, leaving the new international body without the support of the world's most powerful nation. And we know what happens then. Wilson's hopes are devoured in the inferno of World War II. From the ashes of that war, however, came another effort to build a liberal international order. This time, the architect was a politician far more skillful than Wilson. Franklin Roosevelt had briefly been in Paris as Assistant Secretary of Navy under Wilson. He had visited Paris during the 1919 peace negotiations. He shared Wilson's ideals, but believed Wilson had been too idealistic in his methods. So FDR searched for a way to ground those ideals in the realities of power. His vision for the UN enshrined the great powers' status and influence, giving them a stake in a stable world, one in which they had a privileged position. He called them the 4 or 5 policemen. It wasn't entirely clear whether we were going to pretend that France was one of the victors of World War II at that stage. He achieved much of his vision, though at the onset of the Cold War, of course, threw a wrench in those plans. And I think you have to remember that in that period, the most important construction that was taking place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was the creation of a liberal West. You know, we now take this for granted, but don't forget, in the 1930s, to speak about a liberal West when you were looking at Germany and Italy was not exactly a comfortable idea. And so part of what was being forged was a liberal West under an American security umbrella. And that collective construct becomes the free world, the Western world, part of what was later described as the American century. You know, people often forget where the term third world comes from, but it comes from the idea that there was the first world, the capitalist world, the second world, the communist world, and then the third world, the countries that were neither capitalist nor communist and developmentally searching for a path. That, in that sense, the liberal international order we often speak about in those years really only covered North America, Western Europe, and a few Asia-Pacific countries like Japan and South Korea. After the Cold War is when things change dramatically. Two things happen. One, you get a massive expansion of this liberal international order to encompass much of the world. Everyone around the world is joining in to this broader concept. But another thing happens, which is the United States' rise to sole superpower status and supremacy. This was something that at the time was not widely perceived. In fact, most observers missed it. In 1990, the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, argued that the world was splitting into three new political spheres that would be dominated by the dollar, the yen, and the Deutschmark. Henry Kissinger's 1994 book, Diplomacy, predicted the dawn of a new multipolar age. And in the United States, there was very little sense of triumphalism in the early 1990s. The 92 presidential campaign was marked by a sense of weariness and even weakness. The Cold War is over. Germany and Japan won, the Democratic hopeful Paul Sanger said again and again on the campaign trail. Observers of Asia's economic rise began to speak of the Pacific century. There was one notable exception to this, and it was in the pages of Foreign Affairs. The conservative commentator Charles Krauthammer wrote an essay called The Unipolar Moment, published in 1990. But even this triumphalist take was limited in its expansiveness, as the title suggests, a moment. In a follow-up Washington Post column, Krauthammer predicted, the unipolar moment will be brief. He argued that Germany and Japan, the two emerging regional superpowers, were already beginning to pursue foreign policies independent of the United States. Policymakers outside of the US welcomed the waning of unipolarity, which they assumed was imminent. By 1991, as the Balkans began to tear themselves apart, Jacques Pouz, the foreign minister of Luxembourg, and I think at that time the president of the European Council, declared, "This is the hour of Europe. If one problem can be solved by the Europeans, it is the Yugoslav problem. This is a European country, and it is not up to the Americans." It turned out, of course, only the United States, leading NATO, had the combined power and influence to intervene effectively and end the wars in Bosnia. And that then ushered in this period of extraordinary American dominance. The question we have to grapple with when we think about that dominance is that as it was manifesting itself, something else was also taking place that I've written about earlier using the phrase, the rise of the rest. For the last 400 or 500 years, international life has been characterized by the rise of the West. For the last 30 or 40 years, it has been characterized by the slow but steady rise of the rest. After centuries of lagging behind the West, being colonized by it and remaining marginal, many once poor countries rose to wealth and power. So-called emerging markets made up less than a third of the world economy in 1990. Today, they make up close to half the world economy. And this rise has created a new international dynamic, one that resists easy characterization. Scholars debate whether the world today is unipolar or bipolar or multipolar. But the reality is that regardless of whether these newcomers rate as great powers, many of them are acting forcefully in their own interests and resisting being corralled by larger powers. That is perhaps the most important dynamic here, that they have much greater sense of autonomy of action than they have had in the past. I mean, think about a country like Turkey. 40 years ago was a client state of the United States, did whatever Washington wanted. Today, under Erdogan, a powerful sense of its own nationalism, its own destiny, its own independent room to maneuver. And that is the sense in which I've just talked about living in a post-American world. It's not a world that has seen a dramatic decline of American power. The US economy remains the largest in the world by far, comprising about a quarter of all global output, which is still more than the next two countries put together, China and Japan. Since the 1980s, the American share of global GDP has stayed surprisingly stable. America's military is still unparalleled, spending more on defense than many of the next countries put together. But American power might not have declined. American influence has. Global influence is determined only partly by hard power, like military size and GDP. It's also measured by one's relative standing in the world. So while America might be strong, its relative standing has waned. From 2000, say the eve of China's entry into the World Trade Organization, to 2022, the American economy went from being 750% larger than China's to just 40% larger. Countries from India to Saudi Arabia to Turkey to Brazil have all seen their economies grow much faster than the US economy in that period. And in all these countries, you see societies that are stronger economically, prouder culturally, and bolder geopolitically. They have become more confident, seek greater influence, and refuse to be bullied by Washington or Beijing, for that matter. This new reality might not produce a genuine multipolar world. The US and China stand head and shoulders above the rest. But they are less able to dominate other countries the way that Washington or Moscow was able to do in times past. But you have seen a broader fall of America from the lofty heights of the 1990s. I don't know when it began, but maybe the first great crack was the Iraq War. Here you have the world's greatest military power, comprising at that point maybe 60% of global military spending, and it could not succeed against a ragtag group of insurgents. There was also, of course, the issue of how it conducted the war, the civilian casualties, the torture that all undermined the kind of legitimacy of American military power. Perhaps as important was the breakdown of the legitimacy of American economic power, which came with the financial crisis of 2008, particularly felt in Beijing, where Chinese mandarins had always viewed the American model as the most successful, the most efficient, particularly when thinking about the financial system. And the crack that 2008 represented was a substantial kind of fall from grace for the United States. And then, of course, American politics over the last 10 or 15 years has not left the world looking at America as a model for well-functioning liberal democracy. Let me just leave it at that. But it's not enough to just talk about America's failings and fall. What happened was the rise and return of great powers. Ironically, not the ones that Charles Krauthammer thought about, Germany and Japan. It was the rise of China and the return of Russia. And those two stories are at the heart of the return of great power politics, the return of great power tension. And in many ways, they center around China, which is the single most important new entrant into the international system for the last 250 years, perhaps even longer, because Russia, after all, has been on and off a major participant in the international system. And the question that we have to confront when looking at China is a very simple one. Does China want to destroy the liberal international order, or simply to get rich and powerful within it? Under Mao, it was clear it wanted the former. It was funding revolutionary movements across the world, boycotting most international organizations, very much seeking to tear down that system. But after Deng Xiaoping took the reins in the late 1970s, China decided it wanted to become rich and respected, not roguish and revolutionary. It grew powerful within the international system. Today, it is the second largest funder of the UN, and it pays on time and in full, unlike the largest funder, the United States. It covets leadership positions in the UN. It contributes more peacekeeping troops to the UN than any other permanent member of the Security Council. During the 2008 financial crisis, China acted in concert with the US and other leading countries to stabilize the international economy. The previous generation of Chinese leaders, from the current one, believed in pursuing something they described as peaceful rise, in which their country accommodated itself to the existing international order. That has changed. President Xi Jinping seems to have a different view. With America weakened by financial crisis, the Middle Eastern wars, populist chaos, Xi seems to have sensed an opportunity to challenge America's unrivaled status. He began to speak of the East rising and the West declining. In an October 2017 speech he gave at the 19th Communist Party conference, he reflected his interpretation of what he saw as new structural realities. He heralded a new era that sees China moving closer to center stage and making greater contributions to mankind. These heightened ambitions have made China more aggressive abroad. It's taken military action against India, demanded that Australia kowtow to it on a series of issues, from Huawei to Hong Kong, and asserted that long-recognized international waters, in fact, belong to China. It is not China, though, but Russia that has most aggressively undermined the international system. Russia's war in Ukraine, beginning in 2014, is the most brazen action Putin has taken. After the Soviet Union's demise, Russia never fully accepted the independence of Ukraine, which represented, in a sense, a painful reminder of the loss of its great, not Soviet empire, but Tsarist empire, which is 300 years older. It's important to remember how central Russia's challenge to the international order is with the invasion of Ukraine. Since 1945, it has been vanishingly rare for a country to be invaded and wiped off the map by conquest. Before 1945, it was quite usual, and territory changed hands because of military force all the time. I mean, Germany and France went to war 3 times in the century before 1945, and Alsace-Lorraine changed hands 4 times during that period. But since 1945, one of the great achievements of this liberal international order has been that territories acquired by force and aggression are not ratified in the international system. And that is what Russia is trying to do now. So does this Sino-Russian challenge mean that the liberal international order is doomed? Well, I don't think so, not yet at least. Voltaire said of the Holy Roman Empire that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Neil Ferguson says the same of the liberal international order, that it has been neither liberal nor international nor orderly. And it's true that, you know, it hasn't done everything that people expected it to. It didn't encompass the whole world, as I said. God knows the United States has not always acted in a rules-based and liberal fashion. But it is extraordinary that from 1945, it has grown from modest beginnings to encompass more and more of the world. It has been flexible enough to accommodate a variety of regimes from Nigeria to Saudi Arabia to Vietnam. It has survived all manner of crises, wars, state collapses. Why? Because it provides an overarching framework that encourages peace, stability, trade, civilized conduct among nations. It doesn't guarantee it, but it clearly encourages it. It has weathered communism and Islamic terror. It has proved as enduring, I'd say, because most people and most countries are looking for some measure of peace, stability, and an open world in which they can raise the standards of living of their own people. Today, the fundamental challenge that this world order faces is not the Russian or the Chinese challenge, I would argue, and I'll explain why. The fundamental challenge the world order faces is the country that imagined, constructed, and sustained it, the United States of America, no longer seems to have the capacity and, more importantly, the desire to play that hegemonic role. The American public is more ambivalent than ever before about maintaining their country's global role. More importantly, though America is still the pivotal player, it is not supreme anymore. The rise of the rest has created a world with many more active players, none willing to simply follow Washington's diktats. So a new post-American era is forming, but no one quite knows what it will look like. The outstanding question is whether it will be able to sustain an international liberal order without a liberal superpower. In a sense, the present international system evolved over 2 centuries during which the 2 dominant nations, Britain and America, both actively embraced Enlightenment ideas of freedom, democracy, liberty, the rule of law, and human rights. Admittedly, more in aspiration than in practice, but in substantial areas in practice as well. The order's great task, of course, will be to manage Russia's revanchism and China's rise, and perhaps I would have to throw in Iran's revanchism as well. But there are other problems it has to deal with: climate change, pandemics, terrorism. And it's not clear whether it will be able to do this or whether the challenges to it, the tearing away at this international system, will result in what the scholar Robert Kagan has called a return to the jungle, a return to realpolitik. Preserving this order, first and foremost, means facing down Russia's aggression. It has been substantially isolated from most of the richest and most productive countries in the world. It faces a future of technological decay, economic stagnation, and weakness as it becomes increasingly a vassal state of China. But it is a reminder of how large the world economy now is and how much the rise of the rest has taken hold, that Russia is able to swim in very broad and deep economic waters, trading with the Indias and Turkeys and Dubais and Indonesias of the world, and get by. Ukraine will have to find a way not to win by the isolation of Russia economically, but by defeating Russia, or at least showing much greater strength on the battlefield. China poses a very different and broader challenge. It is likely to remain the second largest economy in the world, technologically advanced, powerful militarily, with a huge population, a culture of achievement and innovation. In pure hard power terms, in that sense, we are moving to a world that is bipolar. The States and China dwarf all other countries by traditional measures. But China remains weaker in many ways, especially if you make this distinction I do, which is the translation of power into influence tends to be much harder. Think about it this way. The United States has dozens of formal alliances with countries around the world. China has a formal alliance with one country, North Korea, and an informal alliance with another, Russia. For the most part, it has had very little agenda-setting capacity. It's viewed suspiciously by most of its neighbors. Its economic model is, of course, now challenged, and it faces demographic trends that are gloomy. None of this means conflict is inevitable. If China and the United States move towards a confrontational zero-sum relationship, that will, in effect, result in the unwinding of globalization, the division of the globe into economic and security spheres, and the fracturing of the open liberal international order. There are some signs that we are moving down this path. You can see it in the world of technology. But remember, there is a much larger world than the United States and China. The United States will confront the reality on China, for example, that Europe's economic growth depends on good commercial relations with China. In Asia, almost every country has China as its largest trading partner. I believe that Bhutan is the only exception. China is the largest external trading partner for South America and for Africa. All of these countries are wary of China, and they want, in some sense, to trade with China and have geopolitical ties with the United States. In effect, they want to order a la carte from the international menu, choosing some American and some Chinese items. if Washington or Beijing insist on a prefix, that is, if you want the American fleet, you can't order Huawei at the same time. Countries will find that they will place themselves into a kind of impossible bind and wish that they don't have to make those choices and find ways to try to circumvent the choice. The failure of economic sanctions to deter Russia should remind us of this fact. The world economy is a very vast space, and countries will happily trade with anyone for profit, no matter what America or the West or anyone else says. Washington needs a strategy toward Beijing that mirrors the complexity of these circumstances, one in which China is part competitor, part customer, part adversary, part collaborator. Under Xi, China's objectives are unclear. China does not act like Russia, a defiant rogue state trying to burn the house down, but it often acts in ways that erode the liberal international order's foundations. Xi wants a more insular political system, a more self-sufficient economy, and a society that is less influenced by Western sensibilities and culture. In some ways, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are balancing against not just American power and Western power, but American ideas and Western ideas. They fear those ideas of Enlightenment liberalism and fear that they would undermine their societies, or perhaps more importantly, their hold over their societies. There is a kind of cultural balancing that is taking place in the world, not just a geopolitical balancing. And if you think about the mullahs in Iran, the dictators in China and in Russia, they are all consumed as much by the fear of Western soft power as they are by Western hard power. So the question is, can the West stay strong? Well, if you think about the coalition that supports Ukraine, which I call the West Plus, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, that comprises almost 60% of global GDP. By the way, that's a much larger percentage of global GDP than was arrayed against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. If you look at the Ukraine crisis and the Russian threat, you see a Europe that has become more unified, more strategically minded, and in a sense, the whole West Plus is more closely allied than it was before. And again, the analogy to the Cold War is again worth remembering. There were huge divisions within the West during the Cold War. As late as the 1980s, which we now look at as this kind of nostalgic time when the West came together and defeated communism. Remember, for example, the German government fell because Helmut Schmidt's government deployed American missiles, cruise missiles, over the objection of a vast number of public opinion in Germany and such. So the deep divisions within the Western alliance have been part and parcel of the reality of an alliance of free nations from the beginning. Today, I would argue that in some ways, the West and the West Plus are more closely allied than they have ever been. But of course, it will always be a challenge to hold together this zone of freedom and liberty. What we have to remember above all is that history, it seems to me. The diplomats who founded the European Union were steeped in history and determined to ensure that war did not break out again in Europe. Today's European leaders are beginning to infuse their day-to-day decisions with a similar sense of historical responsibility. Ever since its founding, the European Union has dreamed big, but never been able to overcome its divisions and act as a coherent unit. If Europe finally becomes a strategic player on the world stage, that could change. And that could be the biggest geopolitical consequence of Russia's invasion and perhaps of China's challenge. The United States, too, has to act in a more historically minded way and remember that the most important lesson of the 20th century is that when the most powerful players in the international system retreat into isolationism, you will get aggression and illiberalism. So who will fill the leadership vacuum left by waning American influence? Well, the United States has to make common cause with a more unified Europe, along with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, perhaps joined on occasion by India, Turkey, and some others. So we will watch one of the most interesting experiments in international relations play out over the next decades. Instead of having one hegemon uphold order and enforce a certain set of ideological consensus, we will see whether it is possible to enforce those kind of ideas on order with a coalition of powers, united around shared interests and values. It might mean a more wide, resilient, rules-based international order than the one we've seen that has tended to be dominated by a single power. But there is one final challenge. The challenge is to shore up not just liberal order internationally, but to defend the liberal project within the West. And the two are connected. The United States has never been the perfect purveyor of liberalism, even as it built the liberal order abroad, which itself had its fair share of hypocrisies. The United States failed to fulfill many of liberalism's promises at home. Senator Fulbright is himself a great example of this. As an American senator, he was one of the most influential internationalists of the 20th century, opposing McCarthyism, helping to expose the failures of the Vietnam War, and of course, launching what would become the world's largest educational exchange program. Yet, he was also, to put it bluntly, a racist. He argued against the racial integration of American schools during the Civil Rights era. The truth is that, like Fulbright himself, the liberal system has never been without these contradictions and flaws. But imperfect though it is, America still represents an aspirational vision of liberalism for many around the world. Just ask Xi Jinping and Putin what they worry about. They worry not simply about the liberal international order as a product of American hegemony, but also the liberal values that spread around the world. And so they fight back against both. It's possible that the erosion of cosmopolitan and liberal ideas in these societies will reveal that they rested on a kind of elite consensus that was very specifically Western and does not travel that well outside the West. I'm reminded of a story that John Kenneth Galbraith told when he was John F. Kennedy's ambassador to India. He says that India's first prime minister, the Harrow and Cambridge-educated Jawaharlal Nehru, once said to him, "Galbraith, I am the last Englishman to rule India." And what he meant by that was that the country he and his fellow post-independence leaders created was built on values they drew from deep associations with Britain and the West. Their India was a secular, pluralistic, democratic, and socialist state. I was the first to celebrate when India jettisoned much of its socialist heritage, which had only caused untold dysfunction and corruption. But socialism turns out not to have been the only imported Western idea that countries are now second-guessing. All kinds of Enlightenment ideas, freedom of press, independent courts, religious tolerance, have been fading in countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, and even Hungary. In the West itself, there are people who reject the Enlightenment project. Many voters are opting for populists who present themselves as being in total opposition to this established order. This strain of illiberalism may well be the greatest threat to progress we face. But let's not sound the alarm too strongly and too early. Around the world, what we do see is that when it comes down to it, people still want some kind of Enlightenment liberalism as the foundation of their lives. They want choice, they want freedom, they want autonomy over their own lives. Very interesting new survey commissioned by Ipsos and the Policy Institute at King's College London for this very Fulbright lecture shows this. They surveyed 24,000 people across 31 countries in March and April of this year, and what they found was fascinating. Perhaps unsurprisingly, China, Russia, and Iran all ranked among the worst countries for global influence. What surprised me was that the international paragon of good governance was actually the European Union. Around 3 in 5 people said they would want their country to emulate the political and economic model of the European Union when compared to the American model. This likely means more government support, maybe better social safety nets, but there is clearly a market for Enlightenment liberalism around the world, even though it will look naturally slightly different from country to country. As for the United States, what Ipsos found was that people in most countries have a more favorable perception of it than they did 5 years ago. The one place, the one country where this was not true was in America itself. Compared to 2019, a smaller proportion of Americans believe that the US uses its influence for good around the world. Herein lies the great irony of our times. It is the inheritors of the liberal tradition who have the most self-doubt about their role in the world. After all, America is a nation conceived and founded as part of the liberal Enlightenment. And so if the liberal project is to continue evolving and expanding and getting strengthened in new places, those in the West must not be afraid to boast of its achievements and its success. Liberalism at home and abroad is not dead yet, but liberals could surely kill it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Fareed, thank you very much for the extraordinary breadth of that insight tonight, but also the depth of the information that underpins it. Can I just ask, in terms of the categories of failing that you've identified for us tonight, whether there's one which stands head and shoulders above the others? You've talked of Enlightenment challenges, the translation of power into influence, isolationism, perhaps the lack of a role model or even a role. And you've talked of the legitimacy of power and influence. Is it a people problem, or is it a system problem, or is it just the United States?
I think it's a people problem. Emerson once said that institutions are nothing but lengthened shadows of men. And I think that's very true. When we all talk about institutions and you come out of the legal tradition, but at the end of the day, what were the institutions that held up in the United States in 2020 during that election? It was that, a bunch of courts, a bunch of judges decided the cases correctly. And a bunch of politicians chose not to allow their loyalty to a person to rank higher than their loyalty to the Constitution. It could have been the other way around. It was a very close thing. If the Republican Party had had a majority in the House at that time, majority of Republicans voted to nullify the election of Joe Biden. If you had had a different vice president at that point, so I do think these things are people problems, but people are obviously responding to a larger set of structural circumstances. And I think that the fundamental problem, and this is the subject of my last book, is we are living in an age of backlash. We are living in an age of great cultural backlash to 30 years of extraordinary accelerating change along economic, technological dimensions, but also identity. I mean, just think about something like immigration. The United States was, in 1975, 5% foreign-born. Today it's 15%. That number in Sweden is now 20%, and my guess is, I have not seen a good data on this, but in 1975, Sweden has got to have been 2% foreign-born. So, there's an enormous amount of change that has taken place, and there is a backlash, and that backlash is taking the form of a kind of illiberalism that is very dangerous. But I think we should recognize that some of it is that people are overwhelmed by the pace of change that has taken place.
Can I then open up to the floor? An opportunity to ask questions on a huge variety of issues that have been raised tonight, and probably more. And I'm sure Fareed would be delighted to take questions. Yes, sir.
David Eastwood, Chair of the Fulbright Commission. As Chair of the Fulbright, can I just thank you for a superb lecture, a real tour de force, and just what these occasions should be. As an individual, can I say that I'm profoundly sympathetic to the line of argument that you were developing. around the need for the reassertion of liberal values in order to save the Enlightenment project. And thirdly, can I draw you out on India? You touched on India towards the end, and I was interested throughout how you wanted to place India. I was very struck when I was in China recently about the Chinese anxieties about India, partly about demography, as you hinted. But it does seem to me when you're situating those speculations about the future of liberal democracy, the future of liberal values, what happens in India and the way in which India then seeks to position itself will be crucially important. So I would just like to draw out those lines that you sketched towards the end and ask you to say a little bit more about India.
Sure. It's a fascinating situation, and one that I follow very closely, because I grew up in an India that feels very different from the India of today. I grew up in an India that was resolutely secular and democratic and pluralistic, and that there was a kind of almost, it had been raised almost to a kind of religious belief, that it was something that people said constantly. But I came to realize that the reason that it was that way was because Gandhi and Nehru, the two great founders of India, recognized, I think, how fragile India was in that regard, and were forcing, in a sense, a kind of ideological conformism that they believed was essential. Look, I mean, they saw the country torn apart by religious differences. Gandhi was assassinated by by somebody who thought basically he was being too nice to Muslims. So they were much more aware of the fragility of the system, in a sense, and I think that had a lot to do with the way India kind of had a constructed ideology of secularism, pluralism. Underneath it, I think there was a very, a different India. And what has happened is, over the last few decades, is you have had two things happen. One, those old influences have waned. I mean, for example, I grew up in a much more Anglophone India than in the India of today. India is mostly obsessed with itself, to the extent that there's any foreign influence, it's entirely American. There is, Britain is, again, completely forgotten. Like in Britain, you find lots of nostalgic memories and reminiscences of the Raj. It really doesn't exist. If you asked an average Indian today where cricket came from, they would not probably be able to tell you, And the second is this rise of, of a kind of a real, more authentic India that, is not part of that elite. I'm often surprised when people say that they've come back from India and they'll say, oh, it's so, what I love about the country is everyone speaks English. Now, about 10% of Indians speak English. And so it tells you, when you go to India and you think everyone speaks English, what part of India you're seeing. And what's been happening over the last 20 years with economic growth is the rise of those other people from towns and villages who don't speak English very well, who come out. Look at Modi himself. He is the first genuinely non-elite to become Prime Minister of India. Every other Prime Minister of India was elite either by background or education. So Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister before him, was a very poor, probably poorer than Modi, but got a PhD at Cambridge. He assimilated into that. And so what you're seeing is a much more authentic India. And I think the hope has to be something that a BJP member of parliament said to me, and I've heard in different contexts about Turkey, because it has a very similar story, with Ataturk trying to enforce a certain kind of a set of liberal values around secularism. And this guy said to me, look, the problem is that whenever people criticize Modi and criticize the BJP for Hindu nationalism and things like that, the language they use is the language of Western liberalism. And you're not going to find a path for India that relies on telling it, you've got to adopt these Western liberal ideas. India will have to get to liberalism through its own path. It'll have to find it by finding something in the tradition of Hinduism, which is indeed very broad and pluralistic and tolerant. They're going to have to find a kind of liberalism that is authentic to India's past and India's cultural roots, not just one that came from the West. I thought that was a very powerful statement. The problem is it's very hard. The West invented modernity, and the West invented many of these ideas. And yes, of course, they're universal. That's their nature. But it's harder than it sounds. But I suspect he's right. There will have to be some way in which there is a kind of fusion that takes place with them. The same with Islamic ideas. You can't say that the answer is John Locke. You can't say the answer is John Stuart Mill. You've got to be able to say, if you look at the Vedas, you will find that they have within them, and there is stuff there. And so, some of it is a kind of constructed ideology, just as liberalism is itself, of course, a constructed ideology.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. My question is, don't you think some of the countries that refer as authoritarian regimes or dictatorships, they are trying to build a national identity and sense of nationhood that is somehow argued by some authors as a prerequisite for citizenship and a democratic order. The US had the privilege of being established at the time of the Enlightenment, and it didn't have, of course, they brought the history of Europe, and there was a lot of fascination with classical, Roman, classical Greek. But some of these countries that you're referring to, they have deep and long civilizational roots. So do you think they can build a liberal order without asserting their history, identity, creates an overarching national identity and sense of nationhood in a way that, based on your own, not necessarily you argued that way, but the future of democracy, you highlighted the introduction of liberal democracy without, the middle class, the economic and political institutions, it will be incomplete and it will be illiberal. Thanks.
Look, you ask a very important question. In a way, it's a corollary to what we were just talking about. Every country is trying to find its way to modernity, but while retaining its own cultural past. And as I said, the problem is the West invented modernity. People don't want to admit this, but that is in fact true. And so how do you find a path to it? I was once talking to the curator of an Indian art museum, which had a lot of modern Indian art. And I said, it always strikes me that when you look at Indian modern art, you're sort of like, oh, that's the guy who was influenced by Picasso. That's the person influenced by Rothko. That's the person influenced by... And then there's some attempt to bring folk art into it. And she said, look, that's not just India. Every modern artist in the world has to confront the reality that American post-war art was the standard of what it meant to be modern, how to, of breaking with tradition, abstraction, all of that. And so everyone is trying to find a way to navigate that. And I think that's true politically as well. Look, there's this amazing TV show in China that encapsulates exactly this problem. Rana has referred to it. So I think it's called, Rana, correct me if I'm wrong, When Marx Met Confucius. So here's Xi Jinping's big problem, which I had often remarked on in talks, but I never thought that he completely understood, because he kept talking about how China had to go back to its roots, and it was so Chinese, and it shouldn't be borrowing all these Western ideas. And the rest of the speech was all about the greatness of Marxism, which is, of course, a Western idea promulgated by a German Jew in the 1840s and 50s. And so how do you square the circle that you keep talking about, China's authentic, deep, long-lasting tradition, but your entire system is based on the writings of a. So this TV show has Marx and Confucius meet, and they have conversations about. And you will not be surprised to learn that the way the conversations go is, Marx and Confucius meet, and Marx says, you know, I thought that all these ideas I was putting forward were completely contradictory to yours. I mean, you believe in tradition, and you believe in... And by the end of each episode, happily, they discover that Marxism and Confucianism have an incredibly powerful synergy that can be seen in modern-day China. So there's no need to worry. There's no, you're not borrowing from the West. You're actually somehow fusing these two. And that Marx, in a weird, intuitive way, had actually grasped all the essential qualities of Confucian thought. But that's the problem, which is, yes, everyone is trying to construct, something out of the old. But the problem is, how do you construct it? How do you layer onto it the new when the new comes out of the West? The simplest way to think about it is, look at how men dress around the world, okay? Every man look in China, they're all wearing Western business suits, right? And you see that struggle. Everyone's trying to say, we're different, we're authentic to ourselves. So the Indians still retain a very strong sense of, men wearing traditional Indian clothes. In the Middle East, you still have that sense of, So you can see that struggle in manifesting itself in so many places. But everyone is struggling with the great 800-pound gorilla in the room, which, as I say, is that the West invented modernity.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Lady, second row in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. I'm wondering, you finished your talk by saying, liberals may well finish off the liberal democratic order. I'm wondering what you think the way forward is in dealing with this backlash, this extraordinary backlash that we've seen against a liberal democratic order in the heartland of liberal democracies in Europe, in the US. And is there a way that we need to think about reinventing how we think about our democratic culture? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a very difficult question. I try to grapple with it in the conclusion of this last book. I think at the end of the day, what liberalism has never been able to answer is the question of what does it leave for people to feel irrationally, deeply, and almost religiously attached to. Liberalism fundamentally says the meaning of life is not something given to you by God or religion or the state. It's your choice. You construct your own pursuit of happiness, in Jefferson's phrase. But most people find that very scary. They don't want to do that. Kierkegaard says anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And that sense of not, I think so much of what has happened is the loss of religion, of community, of tradition that has taken place, leaving people feeling, unmoored, and liberalism has no answer for that. People don't build great cathedrals to liberal democratic ideas. They don't write, the B minor mass as a celebration of liberalism. Though Eroica by Beethoven was apparently, in some ways about the French Revolution. But in general, that's the problem. We haven't figured out how to make people feel that stirring of the soul, and there's a part of me that always feels like, well, look, I'm a sort of rootless cosmopolitan, and I think the glory of liberalism should be enough. The achievements it has provided are answer enough, but obviously that isn't enough for many people, and I wonder whether, part of the answer is liberals need to be much more aware of the power of religion and tradition and community and all these sort of, the kind of inner stuffings that make people feel more rooted and grounded. The one thing I'll say is the places that don't have it really value liberalism. So if you look at Ukraine today, right, you see very simply, Ukraine and Poland were
in basically the same situation in 1990. They actually had exactly the same per capita GDP within a few $100s. And then Poland goes west, embraces liberalism, it anchors itself in the Western world, in both economically, politically, but socially. Ukraine is not able to do that for whatever reason. Poland is now 4.5 times richer than Ukraine, having started out just 25 years ago, one generation ago, at the same spot. But it's not just that. They're living lives. They're free people living in the West, living a modern life. And Ukrainians can see that, and they're willing to die for it. I mean, we don't talk about the numbers, but probably 100,000 Ukrainians have died, and I wouldn't be surprised if many, many tens of thousands more are willing to die for liberalism. They wouldn't describe it as such, but you know, it's the absence of it makes you aware of its value, and somehow we are not able to articulate and ideologize and celebrate that, except when it's taken away from us.
Thank you. Right at the halfway up the auditorium on the far left. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ada Hozic, and I'm very privileged to have the Fulbright Distinguished Chair here at Pembroke. And thank you for the talk. I found it very interesting that when you were talking about Kant, you mentioned the fourth principle of the perpetual peace, which is the obligation of countries to welcome refugees. So I would be very grateful if you could tell us how you contemplate, or how do you imagine that this world order looks like from the perspective of those who have become refugees over these last 3 decades. Thank you.
It's a very difficult and important challenge, because I think that especially after World War II, that Kantian idea has increasingly been instantiated into law in many Western societies, most Western societies. And I think in an entirely honorable way, what has happened over the last 10 or 15 years is that the asylum process has broken down. And it's broken down for a variety of reasons. Some of it is just there have been more dislocation, you know, coming out of large parts of the world, say Syria and places like that. But something more fundamental has happened, I think, which is that people have come to realize around the world that the West has created this elaborate system of asylum, a process of asylum seeking. And so if you look at immigration, let's call it undocumented immigration in the United States from the 1980s to now. In the 1980s, what the big problem was people coming in to the United States furtively, crossing the border illegally, and running away from the law and staying in the shadows, never really confronting the law. In fact, always trying to ensure that they never encountered a law enforcement agent. Today, the great problem we have is millions of people crossing the border and rushing to law, to legal authorities, to the law, and saying the magic words, "I have a credible fear of persecution." And once you say that, you are no longer an illegal immigrant, you are an asylum seeker. You get to stay in the United States, you get 2 court hearings, they take 7 or 8 years. During that period, you have to be housed, you have to be fed, and you know, Europe faces the same problem. Now, I in no way cast any aspersions on the people doing it. They are desperate people in need of, you know, in great hardship, and they're doing the smart, rational thing that they should do. But it's not what asylum was, it's not what the system was constructed to deal with. And in fact, at least in the United States, and I know that this is true in Europe, but I don't know it as well, in the United States, there's plenty of evidence that the vast majority of people who come in in this manner now are coming in through an elaborate system of cartels who are being paid in places like, you know, Venezuela and Guatemala and places like that to, you know, to bring people in. So you face a problem. You have to reform the asylum system. You have to find some way to create a system that allows for genuine asylum and genuine refugees without overwhelming yourself with every person who wants to come to a country that is richer. You know, the simplest way you can look at this is people who come leave Venezuela because they claim that they have a credible fear of persecution, travel through 8 to 10 countries in which they would not be persecuted because they want to get to the United States. Now, okay, the United States is probably the most liberal democratic of those countries, but surely if the issue is you're seeking asylum from political persecution, you can't say, I also want to go to the richest country along the way. That's part of the problem, which is how do you disentangle understandable economic motivation for moving with the issue of real refugees, real asylum, real relief. And if you cannot separate those two issues, and if liberals, in my view, do not separate those two issues, what you are going to see happen is what's happening, which is people will vote for very tough right-wing governments. The writer David Frum has a line which I fear is all too true. If liberals will not enforce borders and border laws, the people will elect fascists to do that. And that is happening. You know, that is exactly what has happened in country after country. So we do, it seems to me, we have to figure out some way around this problem.
Yes, on the balcony.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zakaria. My question is very simple. So throughout this whole evening, there seems to have been a theme. Senator Fulbright was a great liberal internationalist, but he was a racist. Lord Palmerston was perhaps a great liberal internationalist, but he was a racist. Woodrow Wilson was a great liberal internationalist, but he was a racist. And these are exactly the critiques that illiberal states such as China and Russia are leveraging against the United States and the United Kingdom and the very liberal internationalist project that they have built. Now, I'm not saying that illiberal states or authoritarian states have had a pristine human rights record, and they certainly don't. But if we were to do the same thing as the Communist Party did in 1982 when evaluating Mao's legacy, by the way, they concluded that Mao was 70% a great revolutionary and 30% a incompetent economist. If you were to give the same evaluation to liberal internationalism and this American international order, what is the percentage that you would give? Thank you.
So I think it's important to remember when you say that all those liberals were racist, that everybody was a racist at that time. I mean, I don't think it did not distinguish those people. It's not that they had some peculiar combination of liberalism and racism, is that everybody was racist. In fact, I think you could make the case, particularly with somebody like Gladstone, that he was considerably less racist than most of the people in the British system at the time. In fact, if you think about his views, he has this famous speech in one of the Midlothian campaigns about Afghanistan, where he says, don't forget the people you are persecuting in Afghanistan are every much the children of God and equal in the eyes of God as you are. If you think about the degree to which his policies toward Ireland, if Britain had had the foresight to have adopted them, would have saved Britain 100 years of violence. He was basically in favor of home rule in the 1880s. All of which suggests, I would say, these people were for the most part more enlightened than the norm, not less enlightened than the norm. But you're absolutely right. Liberalism came out of the West, and the West, particularly in that phase of the 17th, 18th century when it was dominating the world, was deeply racist. It believed it had, it was superior. It, seemed to think that the performance of Western countries compared to other countries revealed that it was in fact superior. And that was terrible. And it was one of the reasons, this is one of the reasons that, Indians have never been as fond of Britain as Brits sometimes imagine, because Indians
Indians loved, and I think of my father as a good example of this. He was a freedom fighter and all that. They loved many of the ideas that the British had, but they were always deeply aware that those ideas did not apply to Indians. They applied to the British, and so there was always that. I remember once my father was a great Churchill fan, and he had all the books and a bust and this, that, and the other. And he told me that when he was in Britain in 1945, he got to vote in that election. Because as a British subject in those days, if you were in London or in Britain, you could vote. And so I said to him, naively, I'm 10 years old, I said to him, so you must have voted for Churchill. He said, good Lord, no, I voted for Labour. I said, why? I thought you were a great Churchill fan. He said, of course I'm a great Churchill fan, but a vote for Churchill was a vote for British imperialism. A vote for Labour was a vote for Indian independence. So there was, even within that, there were people who were more, more tolerant and open. But I would argue that, look, the Enlightenment liberalism is the ideology that has changed and transformed the world. It has created a world that has taken us away from, monarchs, absolute monarchy, the tyranny of church and ideology, the independence of individuals. As I say, it is the ideology that spawned Marxism that is the standard by which Mao was being judged in that case. So I don't think there's any real comparison to look at it, quasi-totalitarian dictatorships and say, do they do some things well? Yeah, I mean, communism. Look, as somebody who grew up, deeply aware of the world of Islam. Many communist movements were very secular, which was a very good thing about them. But, they were also deeply, deeply tyrannical, rapacious. I mean, I think Mao's problems do not end with him being a bad economist. 50 to 70 million people dying in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution is more than an act of bad economics. So I would still, I don't know how I'd put the percentages, but considerably higher than Mao and Stalin, let me put it that way.
Time for one last question. Yes, the gentleman there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zakaria, for your talk. My name is Justin Daniels. I'm a MPhil student in the DPIR. And one theme I sort of picked up on from your talk was sort of the preeminence of the nation state. And that was very much, it seemed like, the focus of how you see the international order being structured in the future. And I think that's a bit surprising, just because it seemed like during those halcyon days when liberalism was triumphant after the Cold War, that the nation state was kind of fading away, and there were these talks of, say, maybe the European Union kind of moving into a more preeminent place, or even metropolitan areas and subnational bodies. And so I guess my question to you is, do you think that has all gone away, or do you think that there is still sort of, do you think that theme hasn't entirely disappeared from post-American international order?
Yes, it's all gone away. I think that was a high watermark. That was an expression of precisely that 30 years of a kind of holiday from history, a single superpower, kind of liberal ideas triumphant. And what you're seeing really is the return of nationalism in a very powerful form. Just forget about, China and Russia. Look at the United States and its attitude towards globalization, free trade, all those kind of issues. America is asserting its sovereign independence far more than any country. And if you look at places like Turkey and India, you see it much more powerfully. The European Union is going to be the most interesting case, because the European Union was created in an atmosphere of deep crisis, a sense that Europe had gone through 400 years of absolutely ruinous wars, 2 world wars that had almost destroyed the continent, and there was a sense of kind of never again. And that fused a kind of a level of global governance or international governance, which is, I think, unique. I don't think it will be copied anywhere else in the world. I don't think it will be a model for any other place in the world. And I think when you look at what is going on now, if you look at the way in which Russia is exercising its votes in the Security Council thing, for example, there were, Russia just voted against, the humanitarian UN agencies were being allowed into Syria, into rebel-controlled areas, to just make sure that people were not dying. Russia vetoed that. There were basically every effort to extend some kind of global humanitarian umbrella has been retreating in the last 5 or 7 years. Look at climate. I guarantee you we will look at the Paris Peace Accords as the high watermark of global cooperation on climate change. It doesn't mean there won't be action on climate change, because I think individual countries have their own reasons to do it, and will do it because of that, because, for example, China wants to be the leader in green technology, and the United States is now in. But the idea that you will have globally, that you will come together to do this for the sake of the planet, I think we've seen the high watermark of that. We'll have to find a way to do global cooperation that is much more rooted in national self-interest. And I think it's a second best solution for sure, but that first best solution is gone.
Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Ambassador, Commissioners, colleagues, the defence of the Enlightenment project is no small task. In a world of theocratic retrenchment, social inequality, and where the concept of progress or modernity are questioned, we are extraordinarily grateful to Fareed for the clarity and persuasiveness of his arguments in support of that project. Ladies and gentlemen, the Fulbright Lecturer for 2024, Dr. Fareed Zakaria.